Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Um, we have a pretty exciting uh, meeting today with presentations from the University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins, uh, summarizing their report, which they distributed and received comments on. And then we are going to be voting on the recommendations that we talked about revised at our last meeting, and then we'll be voting on those and then adding those as addendum to the solar report as recommendations from this uh, council. So, um, and then we will have more opportunities to revise those recommendations by the MTCC meeting next October or whenever they um, talk about the recommendations at those meetings. So, but first we must start off with roll call. So I'll go through that right now. Uh, Senator Benjamin Brooks, Delegate Mike Rogers,
Present.
Tyler Abbott is no longer with MDE. Stephanie Cobb Williams is going to be taking his place. And then I'm also the backup. I don't think Stephanie is on the call. No. Evie Schwartz,
Here.
Secretary Josh Kurtz,
Yeah, good morning. Bob Szynski. I'll be the proxy today for Secretary Kurtz.
okay, thank you. David Chai,
Present.
Diana Menendez and Pearl Donahue, we are looking for replacements for them. And we'll probably have this group on some recommendations as well for replacements because we intend on continuing these meetings into the next year. David Bugelman,
Here.
Stacey Ono,
Here.
and then Scott Elias.
Here.
All right, without further ado, I will turn it right over to Stephanie. Are you going to be presenting?
Yeah, the whole team is presenting, but I think the other Bradley will be controlling our slideshow.
Okay, cool. Sounds good.
Yeah, Bradley, if you want to go ahead and share the screen. So good morning, everyone. All of the working group members on the call should have received a copy of the final report on Friday, along with the technical appendix. The report, as Bradley mentioned, is a collaboration between the Center for Global Sustainability at University of Maryland and the Ralph O'Connor Sustainable Energy Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And we do have members of both teams here today to present the results. Next slide.
Oh, okay.
So what we're going to do is just walk through the results in each section of the report and give you an overview of what's included. So we'll start with a brief introduction to circular economy principles and how they apply to solar, which we do use as a lens throughout the entire report. We'll talk about policy options in this space, what other states and countries are doing. We'll look specifically at the current context in Maryland, and then we'll jump into some of the modeling results that we did, projecting forward different scenarios for Maryland. And then we'll talk a little bit about the impacts of these different approaches and some potential policy recommendations. And then we'll end with some time for questions. So to get us started, I'll turn it back over to Stephanie.
Thanks, Kathleen. So you all have consistently heard about the circular economy and the waste hierarchy through different experts that have spoken to this working group. So I won't belabor this slide, but I do want to emphasize that this framework or way of thinking about the life cycle of solar panels that is not just linear, but also circular, opens up several opportunities for policies and approaches for managing solar panels that are both economical and sustainable. While in this report, we focused on the recovery of solar panels, which include methods to use panels and its components after their expected lifetime, like repairing, reusing, remanufacturing, or recycling. There are different points along the life cycle from resource extraction, design, manufacturing, where circular economy principles can be incorporated as well. And this strategy to consider the entire life cycle of panels will require, of course, engaging with many different stakeholders to ensure a coherent plan for each stage along this value chain. And by doing so, it will be a more comprehensive approach to solar PV systems management. And so I'll turn it over to Bradley to describe existing approaches to regulating and financing end-of-life management.
I think you're still muted, Bradley. I can't hear anything. I still can't hear.
We're talking about the other Bradley, right?
Yeah, sorry, seems to be some technical difficulties here. She'll be back in just a second. Apologies for the delay.
Can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Okay. Okay, and everybody can see the slides again? Okay, so the first policy option we discuss here is extended producer responsibility, which you've seen before. Goal of which, of course, is to hold producers responsible for the collection and disposal of products at the end of their life. Included here in this definition, we mention other designated organizations because in some cases, it's not purely the manufacturers who might be held responsible. Those manufacturers can designate distributors or others that are closer to the customer base that can be responsible in this kind of system. Some notable benefits here is that it promotes responsibility by pushing manufacturers who then have to take back these products that they sell, hopefully improves that their recyclability and design, knowing that they have to take their products back at the end of their life. In many EPR systems, customers are not liable for the cost. And so that's an important feature and benefit here that is often attributed to EPR programs. Some notable challenges include scope and scale and timelines. So the scope of responsible organizations, as I mentioned, depending on how you draw those kind of boundary lines of responsibility, really matters in terms of how well that program may be able to operate, given, let's say, not just the geographic distance, but the economic distance between consumers and the manufacturers of the initial products. And a particular challenge for solar panels, of course, is the long lifetime of the panels. You can imagine a situation where a manufacturer or a distributor is not even in business 25 years after an installation of solar. And so therefore it becomes difficult under kind of a traditional simplistic EPR program to hold a non-existing entity liable for those products. To go into other detail for EPR programs, we wanted to bring up kind of two situations. One that's been brought up multiple times, which is the Washington State example, where multiple years ago, legislation was passed to set up an EPR program. They've continued to, as mentioned here, continue to delay implementation of the program as there are challenges with compliance of manufacturers and others, and particular challenges, let's say, of a single state trying to operate an EPR program of this design. Importantly, though, while manufacturers are liable under this program, other folks can be designated by those manufacturers, including sellers, retailers, and distributors of solar panels, and or an outside product stewardship organization can be designated by those manufacturers. And so importantly, Washington included some flexibility here so that, you know, you can imagine a situation where manufacturers get together and designate an outside organization within the state of Washington to kind of operate the on-the-ground implementation of this EPR program. A very different example of where EPR is being used and has many more years of experience to draw on is in the European Union. And when they set up their program there, they started with lower goals for collection and recycling requirements, and slowly over time have ramped up those goals so that they're collecting higher. The goal is to collect higher and higher fractions of solar panel end-of-life waste, and higher requirements for reuse and recycling in terms of how much of that waste must be recycled and or prepped for reuse is the language they often use. The other notable thing here is that the regulation is across the EU, but the exact implementation details are left up to specific nations. And so there's the benefit here, of course, is that, you know, if you're a manufacturer or other player in the solar industry, you can rely on this huge geographic area to be governed by this policy context. And so there's a dependability there that maybe doesn't happen if you're simply just Washington State operating this program. And different nations then have different, can draw on the different sets of the solar industry that exists in their nation. So in some cases, they have addressed these questions of residential versus utility. Over there, they call it, oftentimes Germany, they call it business to consumer versus business to business type of transactions for solar. And they also have different funding structures to deal with this question of long lifetime. So they might bifurcate the funding and finance of these programs along the lines of financing end-of-life management that is happening today versus ensuring that there is money for 20 to 30 years when the panels that are installed today come offline in 20 to 30 years, financing for those end-of-life management, recycling, and reuse options as well. And just that EPR has been explored in other states in the US as well. There's been pieces of legislation across New York, Arizona, Minnesota, Rhode Island that tried to explore potentially an EPR-like program. And we include this information just to show kind of the wide range under which wide range of characteristics this program can take, from, as mentioned, from states saying, you know, you cannot allow consumers to be charged directly. Other states including or pairing this with a landfill diversion policy, so that, you know, that instead of just purely a landfill diversion policy, which if not paired with something else might leave folks who dismount panels without many end-of-life options here, pushing manufacturers and others to provide those end-of-life options. Others who include recycling and reuse goals in here. And as mentioned, you know, on the right here, Rhode Island included a provision where manufacturers can designate the outside stewardship organizations. Importantly, though, these states haven't adopted these programs yet, but it is to say that other states are considering this type of program. And while any single state adopting this may have particular challenges, one can maybe imagine a more regionalized approach that could have more success with the extended producer responsibility type policy option. The next policy option we'll discuss is an advanced recovery fee system. This has been brought up to the working group as well. Simply, it's collecting a fee from consumers at the time of purchase that funds recycling efforts in the state. Benefits here, of course, being that the costs are fully known at the point of sale and that you are raising revenue at that point of sale to help maybe build out the solar recycling infrastructure. Of course, the challenge with that being there could be a worry that that increased price tag from collecting that fee might disincentivize solar adoption. Of course, that's dependent on the relative size of that fee and things like that. Another challenge will just be kind of on the administrative and physical infrastructure side of determining who then is ultimately responsible for recycling activities. So in the report, we talk a little bit about California here, because for their electronics waste, they administer an advanced recovery fee type system. The state has a lot of bureaucratic structures that help support this, as well as physical structures to help do the recycling. And so that's just a piece of uncertainty here that would really have to be thought through of ultimately who's responsible for the recycling in this kind of system. The next policy option we'll talk about is a little bit more specific and narrow. It's considering a universal waste designation here, classifying hazardous solar panels as a subclass of hazardous waste with streamlined regulations for handling and management. In talking to some stakeholders, it may make handling solar panels easier, more economical for recyclers, especially if there is concern of hazardous materials in those panels. And again, it kind of follows in line with rulemaking that is happening by the EPA right now at the federal level. Challenges here is that some of these opinions about making handling panels easier is not universal across industry actors, and we heard from different recyclers who had differing opinions on this, as well as there's a need to really focus on writing regulatory language that considers storage, transport, and recycling requirements such that you're not imposing a large cost on recyclers due to this universal waste designation. The next policy option we'll talk about is the adoption of industry standards. So here the goal would be to push for best practices across different recyclers and other forms of end-of-life management. Benefit here being that the recyclers that follow those industry standards would have clear guidance from those that are in the industry. It would also, in the case of, let's say, a reuse market, provide third-party verification that could give consumers confidence that industry players are operating by these standards, and also give confidence that the recycling system at large is successful in terms of following standards and guidelines that ensure that a large portion of the waste is being recycled. The challenges here include the fact that oftentimes compliance of these industry standards is voluntary, and actors may decide that it's too expensive upfront to comply to these standards and to follow the necessary processes and to set up the infrastructure to do that. The other thing is, challenge here is there are multiple industry standards in development. Solar Energy Industry Associations talked about their standards they're developing, R2 standards, the EP standards. So with multiple standards kind of at play here, it could make for a complicated matrix that could make kind of for a patchwork of adoption in which the ultimate goal of standardization of best practices isn't realized because of this patchwork and kind of diffuse adoption of industry standards. Another option that is commonly considered and pretty straightforward is a landfill ban that prohibits the disposal of solar modules in landfills. Benefits here, of course, is that there has to be, you're promoting other end-of-life options for solar panels. Oftentimes they're more circular, whether that's recycling, refurbishment, or reuse. And it obviously avoids the potential stress of solar panels on landfills, whether that's material stress or volume stress, or the stress of having to transport a whole bunch of panels to different landfills and the considerations that, let's say, county recyclers or landfill operators would have to make for solar panels. The challenges here are pretty straightforward in the sense of it presumes that there are other end-of-life options. Otherwise, you could get a case where people are just simply storing the panels until another option becomes available. And the concern has been brought up in its real challenge here of potentially solar panel waste being transported out of state, particularly in a geographic state like Maryland, that it isn't too far to the next state border, right? So landfill ban, straightforward policy option, but certainly in and of itself could have challenges if not paired with some other options and features. And we talk about that in the report of what other features could be involved to ensure more success in the landfill ban option. And so we also took some time in this effort to reach out to different stakeholders and have conversations and informational interviews with them. In talking to some folks in the residential solar sector, many of them just mentioned it's something they haven't had to deal with in terms of end-of-life solar management or dismounting them and having to do something with those solar panels. Many of them are, looking for guidance from the state, or have mentioned that would definitely be open to guidance from the state on that side. County recyclers, we got some good feedback from them, and we talk in more detail about the report, and I highly suggest looking at that. Some of them mentioned they wouldn't take panels at all in their landfills. Some of them said they would take a few panels, but not a ton of panels, not truckloads or these sorts of things. And some of them had mentioned that they also felt like they lacked guidance. In one case, the county recycler pointed me back towards this working group, and it was a nice circular moment, whereas, well, yes, I'm talking to you to inform this working group. We also talked to a couple electronics recyclers who also recycle solar panels, one in the state and one not necessarily located in the state, out of state. And an important thing that we learned is just that there are entities, electronics recyclers right now in Maryland that are recycling to some extent solar panels. They mentioned what we kind of had already learned through the literature, that selling reused panels is important because it helps offset what is right now a cost to recycling. They had mixed reaction, as I mentioned, to a universal waste designation. And importantly, I think for many recyclers who might take solar panels right now, it's not their primary operation, right? As mentioned, there's definitely a difference between what's mainly an electronics recycler who will take panels and do the best they can to recycle them versus a previous presentations to the working group from, let's say, Solar Cycle, who are strictly solar panel recyclers and work towards that high value recycling. Moving on to kind of the broader Maryland policy context, and much of this has been covered in previous presentations, so I'll go through it quickly. Utility scale, really governed by this case-by-case basis, operated through the Public Service Commission. There's multiple players involved here, including industry and the PPRP, who will make licensing recommendations to the PSC through this CPCN process. These decommissioning plans often do have language for recycling and reuse that people have brought up, and if you go into the plans, it's informative to look at the language about what exactly they say what they will do with the panels. On the commercial community solar side, they are not subject to the same kind of case-by-case legal process, and so they may be governed by counties that have specific zoning or decommissioning requirements, but not. It's a patchwork of policies across the counties in this instance, even though these installations may share important attributes similar to utility scale solar plants, but not large enough to require a CPCN. The residential side, as I mentioned, there's much less kind of policy infrastructure or processes there. It's dependent on end-of-life options are dependent on who is the owner of the panel at the end of the leasing project, whether that's the homeowner or whether that's the solar company who leased the panels to the homeowner. As mentioned, some of the installers we talked to just have little to no experience in dealing with this end-of-life question, and counties felt like they could use some more guidance on what to do, at least in the near term, for end-of-life options. And the important conclusion here, which has been brought up to the working group, is just that solutions may need to be tailored to each sector, and they need to be, certainly, if nothing else, be flexible and cognizant of the differences between these solar sectors. While it's clear that there's some policy infrastructure there for the utility scale side, it's also clear that there is lacking some policy infrastructure and processes for the residential side. The other pieces of Maryland context we wanted to bring up is just previous legislation that's in this end-of-life solar question. For 3 years in a row, starting in 2018, there was a piece of legislation that set up a PV recycling fund at MDE that was going to be financed by fees on installation and sale price of the first renewable energy credits. In that piece of legislation, none of which made it out of committee. Local governments couldn't charge a separate fee on installation, so it could have had an impact on local government revenue. But overall, it was slated to be cost neutral for the state. And in the middle, we have a simplified diagram of what that piece of legislation was trying to do: charge fees to set up this fund, and that fund would help to seed recycling technologies and processes in the state. Another piece of legislation in 2020 would have directed the Maryland Department of Environment to quickly develop a stewardship program guidelines document that would have kind of pushed manufacturers to set up an EPR-like program. It also included reuse and recycling goals. That piece of legislation was interesting in terms of it's worth going online and seeing some of the testimony of different stakeholders there. It also did not make it out of committee. And so importantly, all these legislative efforts before, there's things to learn about them specifically in terms of how the legislatures felt about them, and the fact that they didn't make it out of committee, I think is an important point. Switching from the policy side to now, what does solar look like in Maryland at this moment? This map on the right is a map of the larger scale solar panel installations in the state. There's more than 2,300 megawatts of capacity that are in installations larger than 1 megawatt, which is graphed on the right. Many of them, the vast majority of them, are smaller than 10 megawatts. The vast majority of them are on what's termed greenfield sites. There's a tiny number that might be on landfills or some that are agrivoltaics, but the vast majority are greenfield sites. And one last piece I'll talk about for current solar deployment in Maryland is just that the vast majority of the technology is crystalline silicon. And there is a small amount, 40 megawatts, that's cadmium telluride, and an even smaller amount that's amorphous silicon. But the vast majority of it is silicon, as shown in the pie chart on the left. And then on the right, data provided by the Solar Energies Industry Association that looks at the evolution of installations in terms of the sector of solar that they come from. And so, you know, we've had utility scale kind of up and down throughout the last decade and a half, residential really growing in 2015 to 2017, and then community solar coming in the last 5 years, strong, you know, accompanying the community solar legislation that passed in the last few years. So now I'll turn it over to Soraya, who will talk more about the modeling as well as other features of solar in Maryland at this time.
Hey, hi everyone. Soraya, thank you, Brad. So this graph is a continuation of the last slide. This is a cumulative graph kind of showing within the different four kind of scales of project and sector what the market share, market penetration is of utility versus commercial versus residential. And you can see, as was described from previous legislation, we see community growing. Roughly, for the modeling sake, we are assuming that going forward to project waste, we're going to get around 30% of the utilization from utility. The infrastructure around utility ends up producing more energy for end users, or the actual citizens, I suppose. Ends up being more efficient. A lot of loss in solar is through the inversion technology and getting this to convert to the grid. And utility scale is, there's larger infrastructure developed around that, in the sense that the efficiency of conversion utility is better. So for waste modeling, we're going to assume kind of worst case analysis for many of these scenarios that we project. Overall, we're basically in all the future and deployments, etc., which we'll see soon, that we're assuming 30% of solar energy through 2050 will be utility, and then 70% will be commercial residential utility. This is subject to change, but also we're basically assuming that current technology is what we have going forward and no kind of process level improvements. Next slide. So just one step back on what does this mean for the waste stream? What does it actually look like? So kind of from ground level, I know from previous meetings this has come up before, but a solar panel is made of several types of materials. Ultimately, we see there's bulk recycling, semi-high value recycling, and high value recycling. And what this means is the amount of money, essentially, or the value of the materials, and the amount of processing that it takes to recover these materials. The vast majority of a solar panel is glass and aluminum. And the great part about that is that those are the two most common existing recycling waste streams. The silicon is what does the absorption, does the actual conversion process energetically. And this is the same material that's used in all their electronics in terms of computation, etc. And this is kind of this zone of semi-high value. And then there are very, very expensive metals, but in very small amounts for high value recycling. For example, silver, I think that's around 25% of the total amount of silver globally produced ends up in solar panels. As a paste for coupling. Tin and lead are used as a solder to get the wires in, and then there's some trace copper there outside of wiring. So, next slide, please. So, how this is an example of a total recycling process. Essentially, how we would recycle a solar panel is the first step. Someone has to say, okay, we're taking this down. So this is what disposition or some sort of measurement of, do we want to keep this panel up or down? After that, there's dismounts, those labor costs there, also job opportunities there in terms of actually moving this panel, this amount of material to the next place, then disassembly. And this is the first chance that we get to look at circularity. So disassembly is taking apart the solar panel. And a solar panel has multiple different types of components, but once it's at the end of its lifetime, not necessarily all of these have failed. For example, if there's a hailstorm and the glass shatters, but the rest of the electronics work, it's possible to remanufacture, in the sense that if you just got a new glass sheet, you could keep the panel in place or not have to actually completely recycle. By recycle, meaning shred down the components to their constituent materials and then put into the normal recycling feedstock, similar to where any other manufacturer in any other industry would buy from. For example, the glass of that solar panel that got shattered, in that case, would be pooled with all glass recycling and then end up into a, what have you, like Coca-Cola bottle. In the report, we talk about the implications of what this means energetically, and possible financial instruments to incentivize this as opposed to other steps. The trickiest part is this delamination process, essentially, which is separating the electronics from the glass sheet. We've, as in previous working group meetings, Solar Cycle, for example, is a company that has a integrated process like this, shown on the right, which you basically feedstock the panel in and it takes it apart. And this is an example of kind of total circularity and recycling, or recovery. The process starts with the solar panel. You put the material into a shredder, similar to all forms of waste recovery, and ultimately all the particles you want to sort into their individual waste stream, and then reuse them and repurify them. The high value aspect is the metals at the end. And also this is the environmental concern, in the sense that if this is not recovered and these are sent to landfills, there are trace amounts of these metals that can have environmental impacts. That being said, the amount of material that's actually in those, the volume of those high value and high risk, in some sense, materials is very, very tiny compared to the amounts of material in an individual panel. And so now we're going to talk slightly about the projections, assuming that this would be this existing process, and this level of processing is will be the final ability of recycling, I suppose, recoverable from a technological perspective. So we modeled essentially 9 scenarios. So we split this 3 by 3. And so I described this as deployment levels. So these are from the Maryland, the Climate Pollution Reduction Plan, from previous working groups, from previous legislation. So the deployment level is the amount of solar panels that are in the field, essentially, to hit various targets based off of the MCPRP plans. The more solar panels we have, the more waste there'll be down the road. Overall, from a greenhouse gas perspective and environmentally, that it can be better for there's less greenhouse gas emission, but the aspect of this working group and this analysis is the end of life policy approach. So we choose the BAU case, which is business as usual. So assuming all the existing current solar deployment and just linear scaling from market standpoint, meaning same amount of people are deploying residential at the same rate. Homeowners are putting solar at the same rate. Utility scale is growing at the same rate. Communities growing at the same rate as it has been since 2014, when we have the most accurate data. Then there's the current policy scenario, which includes several bundled policies, which are outlined in MCPRP. And then there's the current plan policies also outlined, which is would be the most aggressive in terms of the amount of solar panels that would be out there, and therefore the most amount of waste ultimately when those panels reach end of life. And so in most of the slides, we use the current plan policy scenarios as the worst case assumption in terms of the amount of waste that would happen at end of life for the amount of volume of material of all these panels once they have to go somewhere. From the end of life perspective, there is 3 options that we model. One is the no policy. So all panels are landfilled. So this is essentially no regulation, though this is not typically what happens, but that would be the most worst case scenario, which we will refer to again. So the most amount of panels, and all of them are just thrown away with no form of circularity, no form of recycling for any of that, or any of the materials involved. Then we model a recycling mandate, which is very similar to both the EU and South Korea have policies where essentially 80% of the material, it has to be recycled starting in 2030, and 85% kind of a step up, so that there's a kind of a learning curve for the recycling centers and the actual facilities perspective. And then we look at the actual circularity economy. So this is where we start looking at remanufacturing, reuse, keeping panels up past what their economic lifetime is. So overall, we model 9 scenarios, which is the amount of total panels in at each time at different rates to hit various targets for pollution reduction, and then 3 different scenarios of what would happen at the end of life for panels. So currently, this is the deployment projections. So from 2010, which is when the first panels that were kind of being reported, or the energy produced by them being reported on a state level, till this year, which is about 13 years later. You can that's just the green part from 2010 to 2023. So these are all the panels that are going to reach the end of life until 2050, because all of these will be all these are in use and reaching decommissioning. Things that are being installed right now in 2023, assuming a 30-year lifetime, it'll be 2053 even before they're economically at end of life, let alone any sort of end of life policy management. So, and on this right bar, we look at the for caveat here is that this isn't the actual area of land space in Maryland that this amount of solar panels would take. For example, like residential solar panels are already on existing facilities. Utility scale things are typically spaced more out. But even in the most aggressive deployment of solar, or the most amount of solar as a within the renewable portfolio, it would be about 25 square miles in 2050 is how much area would be needed, which is not that much actually relative to the state, and we'll get more into this in the next few slides. So the software we use, or the modeling, is based off of NREL, National Renewable Energy Labs, made a essentially a software called PBICE, which has been used by multiple states and multiple countries at this point, to input just the raw technological aspects of solar, and like, for example, the module performance, how fast these degrade, what's the lifetime, how much material, what types of materials are being used, since that also has been evolving. Meaning the actual panel from 2010 actually has a relatively different composition from a panel that's manufactured now. And then we can input our recycling rates, etc., and then we output like what type of waste would exist, such that the balance of how the software works is that you continuously hit the amount of installed capacity and the amount of energy generated to hit the energy generation targets, in the sense that more waste is produced if more panels have to exist, such that you need this amount of wattage, let's say, or kilowatt hours produced per year, based off the MCPRP targets. And so some of the assumptions we use in the modeling, so in all cases, we're assuming that only 80% of modules are collected, which is also in line with the EU targets. So we're assuming 20% of the time, not necessarily that these are actually transported to a landfill, but the disposition, the actual assessment of a panel, only 80% of the time is this even going to happen. Everything else we'll consider as general waste for the state and for waste management and for recovery management. And then in each of the 3 EOL policy scenarios, we have reuse, resale, we have remanufacturing as an option, which would be in the circular scenarios. Remanufacturing means, instead of actually shredding the panel, totally recycling it, breaking down the components into their feedstocks, their actual materials. You preserve the components as opposed to the raw atoms, I suppose. And then landfill option is essentially there's no management policy. The recycling mandate, the recycling mandate is this 80 to 85% scale up rate, and the 20 to 15% landfill rate is, again, like from existing policies that are through the WE, EU, and South Korean policy. Excellent. So the kind of high level results here, we're not really going to see a lot of waste relative to what current waste management facilities, professionals, etc., are seeing until around 2030. As Bradley discussed earlier, this is kind of where we come in. There's not a lot of guidance as to what happens because there aren't that many panels other than kind of accidental or probabilistic failures, or just the electronics failing, or a random hailstorm or something like this, causing a panel to be at the end of life. In 2010, the industry standard was around 20 years. So around in 2030 is when we're now going to see the earlier installs in Maryland, the earlier installed capacity actually reach its economic end of life, meaning like the warranty, how long it should be performing, to what level based off of whomever buyer, installer, or agent, stakeholder has control of the panel and how much energy they get out of this. After 2030, this kind of exponentially takes off, in the sense that now we're seeing all the current things being installed reach end of life until about 2050, which is where we see the MCPRP goals projected to. There's actually little difference in terms of waste, because the panels that are reaching end of life in 2050 have just been installed in the last few years. So regardless of how much growth happens in the next few years in terms of new deployment, new installations, the waste stream is not going to see any effect till 30 years delayed. 30 years delayed means that from now till 2050, it'll be till 2050, 2080, where the amount of build out of solar and the amount of deployment will really drastically change what the waste streams are, the amount of panels entering waste management. This plot on the right, so the blue curves are assuming the business as usual deployment levels. So the colors of each of these are by the deployment level, and you can kind of see that. And then the end of life policy options are within each set of colors, kind of the reduction of waste that would happen based off of our end of life management policies. And you can see we have this kind of crossover point in the sense that the end of life policy management eventually has a massive effect on how much waste we actually see and how much environmental impact, how much material is irrecoverable. So there is absolutely a degree of mitigation for the amount of deployment that end of life policy can mitigate over time. And so in the very short term, we model, so this is starting in 2030, the cumulative waste amount of tons of material, and this is just aggregate amount of material, very slowly starts ramping up, and then about 2038 we see 2.5 thousand, or so 2,500 tons of solar panel waste, assuming there's no other form of management, and this is all based off currently deployed solar panels. From 2038 to 2050, which is the kind of where we have targets for the amounts of solar we'd like to build, or different types of energy breakdowns or portfolios, or we see that this kind of takes off a lot. So the 2.5 thousand tons turns into around 55,000 tons. But in the landfilling scenario, which is the red bar, this assumes there's no policy, and this can be reduced around 40% per by using the recycling mandate, and then an extra around 5% if we use a circular economy in terms of from the waste perspective. And then going kind of back to the what does that waste look like? What types of materials are in there? Again, this is very predominantly glass and aluminum. I apologize. One moment. I have to plug in my charger. I'm sorry. I apologize about that. So in each case, we see that the amounts of the waste is again predominantly defined by just what the panel composition is. And so even if you have total recycling, the efficiency of the recycling processes, etc., you can't completely reclaim all the glass. You can't completely reclaim all the aluminum. But you kind of have this constant issue of the encapsulant backsheet, which are polymers. They're like plastic essentially. And that the amount of plastic used will always kind of be there, since basically there's no way to really get that material back from a technological perspective. In the long term, this also once again kind of not exponentially grows, but order of magnitude grows. I think it equates to about every 12 years after 2030, there's one order of magnitude amount of or 1000x amount of material waste that will be entering the waste stream. So in the long term, so this is post 2050, where we're now, the amount of solar waste is completely defined on what new installs from today, from 2024 in the next few years, until 2050, the amount of build out of solar and the amount of market share this takes in terms of energy generation. The waste will happen from that 2050 to 2085. So we are choosing in these scenarios, the bottom two graphs show kind of the amount of material that you recover based off of the end of life policy. That being so, this bottom left graph is essentially a time and compositional breakdown of the light blue area, like this area between the landfilling and recycling mandate policy, and then the circular economy versus landfilling EOL policy is the light green area plus the light blue area versus landfilling. So we see that in terms of from a policy and incentive perspective, and also from a circularity perspective and economic growth within Maryland, there are hundreds of thousands of tons of glass and material and aluminum that would be available based off of the choice, any sort of policy to have end of life management for solar panels. And the glass, the aluminum, these are things that in general like are already recycled. So all this mass can be reused somehow, and we'll talk about recommendations slightly later. So the long-term results, this is kind of from that high level zoomed in. If we implement the recycling mandate, which is effectively which is basically exactly what the EU and the South Korean policy is, the amount of waste entering landfills from solar is reduced by 40%, kind of by any build-out level. And then 45% with the circular economy policy model. So 40% is quite a bit. The just simply recycling the materials through traditional recycling processes will keep a lot of waste outside of the landfills coming from solar specifically. This also reduces the amount of energy. So this is kind of one of the cruxes of the circular economy aspect. It takes quite a bit of energy and time and resources to produce or manufacture a solar panel. And the glass, for example, on the top of a solar panel is very, very clean and highly refined glass. The silicon used is very high purity. The aluminum frames are exactly spec'd out and highly refined. So the idea with circular economy is if one of these kind of components fails,
Sorry, are you still there?
I think I locked them as well.
I could jump in here because I was going to jump in on the next slide. I think the point he was trying to make is that given the energy intensity of both manufacturing and even in some cases the recycling, the more that you can push for these circular economy options means you're reducing those energy needs and material needs in the future. And some of these materials are going to be needed for other clean energy technologies and whatnot in the future as well. And so we wanted to put all these results in the context of what kind of waste looks like in the state right now. And so on the left, we have a graph from an EPA database on municipal solid waste landfills in the state. As we could see, there's states going to have to consider the fact that some of these are closing in the next couple decades and obviously there's a finite amount of landfill capacity in the state, and that will be a consideration the state has to make moving forward. The graph on the right, we try and break down and kind of push back against some maybe common misinformation around floating around solar being, a huge portion of these landfills. And the fact of the matter is, even in kind of our high waste solar estimate, it's a tiny, tiny fraction of the amount of waste that's landfilled in a given year in Maryland. So bar on the left is the total disposed and recycled waste generated in Maryland in 2022. Middle bar is the amount of that disposed waste that is landfilled in the state. And then the tiny fraction of a bar on the right is our very worst case annual waste from one of our modeled years. And so on average, the amount of waste is even much smaller than this in a given year. And again, just to give the case that, to make the point that even in our modeled quote unquote worst case scenario, the amount of waste here is quite small relative to the total waste kind of handled by the state. But importantly, it's worth looking at the report for this too, that it will be a notable and comparable fraction to other electronic waste that the state handles, and that's something to consider. So we'll quickly go through some of the broader impacts, and many of you know this information at this point, but comparing solar against other generation technologies, it has a lower greenhouse gas impact over its entire lifetime that includes manufacturing and whatnot. Obviously has a lower particulate matter pollution impact on a per unit energy generated compared to fossil fuels. There's mineral demands and land space requirements that are environmental impacts to consider with solar, as well as the potential but decreasing potential for toxic materials as manufacturers work to remove those materials from panels and manufacture cleaner panels. economic impacts of solar. We have some interesting information on the report on the employment side, as well as implications obviously for land, grid impacts as you have more intermittent electricity generation sources, the need for storage, of course, as well as air quality impacts or kind of secondary economic impacts. In terms of how decommissioning might impact ratepayers, this is something that is just not studied well in the literature right now. And Garvin Heath from NREL had presented to this group a few months ago, and when we talked to him, he also mentioned there just isn't information and studies out there about this. And some of that has to do just with the inherent complexity of the rate making process, the lack of data to understand how these end-of-life costs are potentially trickle down to the consumer. So we'll move from these impacts into our recommendations, and I'll go through these kind of quickly. Our first recommendation is just to continue and increase stakeholder engagement. Obviously, there have been many different stakeholders that have come and presented to the group, but importantly, there are folks that are recycling in Maryland and have a very useful perspective and could provide great information and perhaps even data to the working group to help understand this issue at the state level. Our second recommendation is to operate at a multi-state and regional level. As we mentioned, many of the policy options, a lot of their challenges have to do with the geographic scope of the policy. And so if Maryland were to try and partner with Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Virginia, and Delaware, and others, there might be some synergies to working regionally on these types of issues and take advantage of those that maybe already have solar recyclers in their state, like North Carolina. The state, our third policy recommendation is the state should consider a landfill ban coupled with a financial incentive. And here the idea being that right now there is certainly a cost gap between recycling versus landfilling, and the state may be able to incentivize other options beside landfilling by closing that cost gap. Our fourth recommendation is to address current and near-term gaps. So specifically the non-utility solar sectors could use some more guidance, and also that because the waste stream is small in the next 10 to 15 years, as Suraya's presented on, there might be an opportunity to use kind of innovative, flexible ground-up solutions, perhaps even tapping into, let's say, workforce development programs throughout the state that could incorporate either decommissioning or dismounting and end-of-life handling as part of their curriculum. And you could imagine a situation where these workforce programs work directly with consumers and others who are dismounting or replacing their panels or something to handle the near-term end-of-life volume for solar, and partnering with those recyclers that are starting to recycle solar. Our fifth recommendation is to support existing electronics recyclers. So as I mentioned, there's at least 2 of that we believe are trying to recycle solar to some extent right now. There are other electronics recyclers in the state that are certified to some extent to the R2 standard, which is a standard that was presented to this working group in the last few months. Appendix G of that standard particularly applies to photovoltaics. And so working with existing recyclers to get certified to that Appendix G could help start to build out the existing solar recycling infrastructure in the state. As kind of mentioned earlier, our 6 recommendations define to build upon in-state synergies. When we look at some of these solar workforce development organizations in the state, a lot of them didn't have much in the curriculum in terms of either end-of-life management or dismounting and decommissioning. And so there might be a way to broaden those curriculums and also use that expertise to push for greater end-of-life consideration in the industry itself. Our 7th recommendation is to weave the waste hierarchy into the above recommendation. So the idea being that no matter kind of which option you choose, there are ways to push for more reuse. There are ways to push for repairing on the spot. There are ways to push for recycling in all the above recommendations. And then the last one is just to realize that the whole solar end-of-life policy world is changing and changing quickly. State and federal policy is evolving. States are really considering and are in a similar space as Maryland right now, where they have working groups or reports are being written and legislation is being considered. The industry is evolving and industry standards are being developing. Recycling facilities are coming online, and that is something that Solar Energy Industries Association has brought up as well, is that in the next 5 years, there'll be even more recycling facilities that are coming online. And as well, solar technology is changing, right? It could be the case that in 5 to 10 years, we have to consider a different technology that is starting to deploy more readily. So it's point being here that because it's a very much evolving policy context, the state should revisit this policy annually. And with that, I'll turn it back to Kathleen.
Thanks, Bradley. So I know we're a little bit short on time now. We are happy to take some questions, but I'll leave that up to Bradley if you want to move on to the working group voting on recommendations or what you think is the best use of time here.
I think we could take one or two because we did
Okay.
review these recommendations in our last meeting, so people should be familiar with them. And we did make some text edits to make them a little bit more palatable as well. So I'm hoping we can get through them.
Great. Yeah, so then if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer those now.
Oh, I apologize. My laptop has actually just finally entered the e-waste stream after a long extended life. But happy to answer questions.
Well, if there are no questions, then we'll turn it back over to Bradley.
Yeah, and I just really want to thank UMD and Johns Hopkins for all of the effort that you all put into this. I know we were meeting on a monthly, sometimes more than that basis, just kind of working through all of these details. And yeah, just want to thank you for helping out with this. All right, now we are going to move to our recommendations. Let me share my screen. And just a note, the recommendations that we are going to be voting on right now, some of them are similar, but there were some differences from the recommendations that we just saw in that report. These recommendations are going to be specific recommendations voted on by the working group members. And we do have a quorum this time to do the voting. And I actually did get an email from Delegate Mike Rogers, or from Senator Benjamin Brooks, not Delegate Mike Rogers, that Senator Benjamin Brooks unfortunately cannot make it to this meeting, but is in favor of all of these recommendations. So, but we'll be getting the votes from other folks. So if you remember last time, we went through these recommendations. We had some proposed language changes. We softened up some of the language as well. And so instead of, I think on a lot of them, we had should implement or we had should consider. So these are considerations for the General Assembly. This isn't necessarily a consideration for legislation. So the General Assembly would take that consideration and then they would decide whether they would want to do legislation or not. So so yeah, let's walk through each one of these. And then since I did email these out already and on November 1st, and we did talk about these at length at the last meeting, I'm hoping we can get to the voting pretty quickly on them.
Hey, Brad.
Yeah.
Just a quick note. I mean, I've looked at them, and similar to Senator Brooks, I'm good, and certainly want to thank UMD and Johns Hopkins for all their support. And I only jump in and say that because depending upon how long this goes, I've got a delegation and Arundel County delegation voting meeting where we're picking leadership for this upcoming session. So if I have to drop off, that's why. And so with that, I'll shut up and let you do your job.
All right, and just folks, you can also vote yes, no, or abstain on these. All right, so the first one is the General Assembly should consider a delayed start landfill ban for solar PV modules starting between the years 2028 and 2035. So this is the range based on some of the feedback that we received from the working group, and this 2035 date was the recommendation from the university student that David Comas, the master's student that David Comas is working with. So, and then just have the context and qualifications for this recommendation. So are we good to start voting on this? All right. Hearing none, I'm going to go to Delegate Mike Rogers.
Yes.
Stephanie, I don't think is on the call, but MDE is voting yes on this one. Eddie Schwartz.
Yes, Ramier.
Bob Sandzinski on behalf of Josh Kurtz.
Yes, for DNR, I vote yes.
David Chai.
PSC abstains.
Abstain. All right. David Bugelman.
I'm going to have to abstain unless, is there somebody from the residential solar industry on that's going to vote?
We don't have someone from residential solar. Stacey Ono with community solar. And maybe that's something that we should consider for next year. Again, we will have another opportunity to vote on these for the MCCC next. Make adjustments and vote.
Okay. I'm going to abstain, and it's largely because of that lack of industry participation. I'm really concerned about that sector and whether this is viable and what the effect would be. As I've said before, utility scale, I think there effectively already is a landfill ban, but I can't vote on this without a full range of viewpoints.
All right, understood. Stacey Ono.
I would abstain.
And then Scott Elias.
I vote yes.
All right, moving on to the next one. The General Assembly should consider the efficacy of a post-consumer to recycled content phase goal in the manufacturing of new solar panels sold in the state. So just a reminder of what this would be. This would be requirement to use a certain percentage of recycled content in the manufacturing or recyclable materials in the manufacturing of solar panels sold in the state of Maryland. So it could be like of the glass that's in the solar panel, 30% of it is recycled. Now that, and you can do it by material that's in the solar panel as well. Obviously, there's better markets for some of the metals than some of the other materials. So it would kind of depend on what you can do this by material as well. So, and then here we had it should consider factors such as consumer affordability, the cost of recycling, and Maryland's renewable energy goals. So, if there's no further discussion on this, I'll move to Delegate Mike Rogers.
Bradley, before we vote on this, I just want to clarify a quick question here. So just to make sure I'm understanding this, this is asking the General Assembly to create effectively a requirement that the modules sold within the state of Maryland would need to have a certain degree of post-consumer recycled content within it?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
And really, they're just considering it. This isn't whether there's going to be legislation or not.
Okay. Okay. We can move to the vote. My concern is that that's not feasible today for silicon solar cells and backsheets and a number of technologies.
And I should note, when this gets implemented for other materials, let's say like packaging or something like that, they do a phased in approach. So it could be like 5% within the next 5 years, 10% within the next 10 years, 20% within the next whatever. So you can scale it up if the markets aren't there. And that's what it means by phased goals right here.
Got it. Thank you. We can move on.
Okay. Delegate Mike Rogers.
Yes.
MDE is voting yes on this one. Evie Schwartz.
MEA votes yes.
Bob with DNR.
Yes, DNR votes yes.
David Chai.
PSC abstains.
David Bugelman.
No.
Statio no.
Abstain.
And then Scott Elias.
No.
All right. Moving on. This one we actually have two versions. We have version 1 and version 2. So the first one is the General Assembly should consider implementing incentives to bring a solar panel recycler to Maryland, or working with surrounding states to establish a regional solar recycler. And then version 2 is the General Assembly should consider working with surrounding states to establish a regional solar recycler, which could include Maryland. So for this one, if we can just ask folks to vote on version 1 and version 2 at the same time, and then we can move from there. So Delegate Mike Rogers.
Yes.
Yes on both of them?
Yes. Because so we're gonna come back and have another conversation after we vote on both, correct?
Yes. So in October of next year, we'll be submitting recommendations to the MCCC. These are just the recommendations that are going to be attached to the report, which is going to be delivered at the end of the year.
Okay.
Yep. MDE is voting yes on version 1 and no on version 2. Evie Schwartz.
MEA votes yes on version 1 and no on version 2.
Bob with DNR.
DNR votes yes on version 1 and no on version 2.
David Chai.
PSC abstains on both.
All right. David Bugelman.
Yes on version 1, no on 2.
Statio no.
Yes on version 1 and no on version 2.
And then Scott Elias.
Yes on version 1, abstain on version 2.
All right.
Hey, Bradley, so upon further clarification, yes on version 1 and no on version 2.
All right. Hold on. I just need to go back in my tracking sheets. Cool. All right. The next one is the General Assembly should require decommissioned recycled solar panels to be sent to recycler with acceptable certification. This could be, for example, R2 or E Steward. or any other standard that is out there. All right. Delegate Mike Rogers.
Yes.
MDE is going to vote yes on this one. Evie Schwartz.
MEA votes yes.
Bob DNR.
Yep, DNR votes yes.
David Chai.
Abstain.
David Bugelman.
I'm gonna have to vote no, and the reason is I'm concerned about creating a catch-22 where panels need to be recycled, but then there's no place for them to go, and then we're kind of left with the situation where project owners are stuck effectively. So I would consider voting for something similar to this if we could nuance the language, but this version I can't vote yes on.
Okay, and we can again, we'll have another bite at the apple next October. Stacey O'Neill.
I would abstain for a similar concern. I think, the version 1 language is should consider, but then we're saying here that the General Assembly should require. So it's stronger language where there's nothing, they may not be anything in place.
So I think that was actually an oversight. I think at the last meeting, we talked about changing these to all should consider. So I don't know if that changes. I'm gonna change that to should consider, since that's how every other one reads.
Bradley, for what it's worth, that's what I recall as well.
Yeah, that was an oversight. My apologies. Does that change anyone else's vote?
And I think someone mentioned more nuanced language. So maybe something like, if version 1 or 2 is in place, something like that. But for now, I would abstain with the current language. Thank you.
And just so that we're talking about the same one, this recommendation only has one version right here.
Right.
Can you clarify? Is the language now that the General Assembly should consider requiring decommissioned recycled solar panels be sent to only these? Or the reason I ask is I know you didn't get to my vote yet, but my concern is even if the General Assembly is considering that, there are very few R2 or E steward solar panel recyclers in the U.S. today. So I actually think, for what it's worth, this requirement would stifle recycling establishment. It's going to take time for there to be all this. So even if it's should consider requiring, I'm going to, when you get to me, vote no, but did want to provide that context.
Okay. Yeah, and that's something that we can work on next year. So Scott, your vote is no on this one?
Correct.
Okay. All right. The next one is the General Assembly should consider the development of a stewardship organization, typically a nonprofit, to help manage the end of life collection of residential solar panels. So these are specific to residential. And then here is the context that we talked about last time. There was a lot of stakeholders that felt like utility scale solar already had a lot of solutions with the plan, and there were already contracts that are set up, and there's effectively a landfill ban. So this is specific to helping out residential folks who are going to have to think about this when their solar panels are decommissioned.
And Bradley, just a quick question on this, just because I wasn't at the last one. This is distinct from a stewardship organization that's supposed to be an extended producer responsibility organization, right? That's not being intended as the same in this context.
So it could be a stewardship organization is a little bit broader, I would say, because sometimes the state runs the stewardship organization.
Got it, but it's not going to require the manufacturer to be the one responsible, is what
not as written, but it could be an extended producer responsibility organization or a producer responsibility organization that runs a stewardship plan. This is just saying that there is an organization that will help help residential
Got it.
solar
Okay.
decommissioning. Yeah. All right. All right, Delegate Mike Rogers.
Yes.
Indy's gonna vote yes on this one. Evie Schwartz.
MEA votes yes.
Bob with DNR.
DNR votes yes.
David Chai.
PSC abstains.
David Bugelman.
Yes.
Stacy Ono.
Yes.
And then Scott Elias.
Yes.
All right. So this next one is going to have two versions, and it's kind of split on the pages right here. But version 1 is the General Assembly should consider establishing incentives to promote reuse, repair, refurbishment, and recertification or donation of solar panels before recycling is considered. The goal would be to have a local closed loop recycling economy in Maryland or a regional recycling economy. And then version 2, the General Assembly should consider establishing incentives to promote reuse, repair, refurbishment, and recertification or donation of solar panels before recycling is considered. Any questions on those?
So yeah, Bradley, if you could sort of kind of lay out what the primary difference between the two versions is.
Yes. The first one is really focusing on a closed loop recycling economy in Maryland for those activities. So if you're going to reuse the solar panel, then the incentive would essentially prioritize that reuse in Maryland before regional recycling economy. And so that's kind of the main difference between those.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So Delegate Mike Rogers.
Version A.
So yes on
Yes on A.
And then no on the second one.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Indy is gonna vote no on version 1 and yes on version 2. Evie Schwartz.
MEA votes no on version 1 and yes on version 2.
Bob with DNR.
DNR votes no on version 1 and yes on version 2.
David Chai.
PSC abstains as to both.
David Bugelman.
No on 1, yes on 2.
Stacy Ono.
Abstain on 1, yes on 2.
And then Scott Elias.
Abstain on 1, yes on 2.
All right. Cool. All right. I think we have 3 more to go. We're making really good time. The General Assembly should consider incentives for workforce development training to reduce breakage during decommissioning and transportation due to gaps in labor training or insufficient shipping practices. Just a reminder on this one, there were concerns that there could be a lot of breakages during the transport, and then really just having a trained, competent people that are actually doing the transportation, which would make these solar panels more likely to go to reuse as opposed to recycling. which you can fix them, but that could cost a little bit more as well. So, Delegate Mike Rogers.
Yes.
MDE is going to vote yes on this one. Evie Schwartz with MEA.
MEA votes yes.
Josh Kurtz with DNR, or sorry, Bob with DNR.
Yeah. DNR votes yes.
David Chai.
PSE abstains.
And then David Biegelman.
Yes.
Stacy no.
Abstain.
And then Scott Elias.
Yes.
Okay. Back to our last two, and they're sort of similar. So the first one, well, we'll go over the first one. And then actually I'll go over the second one. And then explain how we came to the first one. So the second one is the General Assembly should consider an advance recovery fee for residential solar. So this is residential only, to help pay for a stewardship organization costs of collection and processing of solar panels owned by residents. Now, the reason why we have this recommendation is, as I was going through the notes in the meeting minutes of the calls, we had to recommend a financial mechanism per the law, essentially. And this is the only one that I could pull from in the meeting minutes had to do with an advanced recovery fee. Now, in our last meeting, we added this second one, or first, depending on how you're looking at this other recommendation. The General Assembly should consider funding a study to determine appropriate end-of-life management financing solutions for residential PV solar panels. So that's why we don't have other financing mechanisms essentially in here, because the advanced recovery fee, after looking through the meeting minutes, that was the only one that I could find on that, if that makes sense. All right, so let's go to this first one right here. The General Assembly should consider funding a study to determine appropriate end-of-life management financing sources for residential PV solar panels.
Yes.
Yeah, Delegate Mike Rogers is a yes. NDE is going to vote yes on this one. Evie Schwartz with MEA.
MEA votes yes.
Bob with DNR.
DNR votes yes.
David Chai.
PSE abstains.
David Biegelman.
Yes.
Stacy no.
Abstain.
And then Scott Elias.
Abstain.
All right. And then the second one right here, the General Assembly should consider an advanced recovery fee for residential solar only to help pay for the stewardship organization's costs of collection and processing of solar panels owned by residents. So Delegate Mike Rogers.
No.
MDE is going to vote yes on this one. Evie Schwartz.
MEA votes yes.
Bob with DNR.
DNR votes yes.
David Chai.
Abstain.
David Biegelman.
Abstain again, largely because of the lack of a residential solar participant.
Understood. Stacy no.
Abstain.
And then Scott Elias.
Yes, and I'll just clarify, this is a conversation that companies are having in California and elsewhere. And I think I've consulted SIA and some resi companies on this. So I vote yes.
Okay, I'll change my vote to yes then.
David, was that you?
It was. Yep.
Okay.
So Bradley, I don't. If I was going to ask a clarifying question, but I mean, if you got someone else that needs to vote, you can go ahead and do that first.
So that was all of the votes. So yeah, go ahead with your question.
Yeah. So what we're saying is that the residential customers should be taxed to be, or yeah, that's have be to determine how they're going to dispose of panels once they're done, or to consider what to do with that. But that's going to be that's going to be placed on the residential customers, and that's all residential customers, not just the folks that have solar, right?
No, it would just be on the if you are buying solar panels as a resident, there would be a small fee on top of that. So we do have, it should consider consumer affordability, the cost of recycling, and Maryland's renewable energy goals. So we do have some caveats with that. And then that fee would then go to the steward. It would essentially finance the stewardship organization. So when solar panels are decommissioned, the stewardship organization would come in, or sometimes a contractor that they hire, or however it's set up, would then know where the recycling markets are, so that the resident doesn't have to come up with those costs. And the conversation that we had, or the resident doesn't have to figure out where, like, what's a legitimate recycler and all that stuff. Or if it can go to reuse, you really have a professional that's helping you out with this. And the reason why we focus this on residential is just based off the conversation was utility level solar that's already gone through like the PPRP. They already have to develop a plan. They already have bonding, which pays for the end of life of solar panels. So there's already a process and financing to manage those solar panels. You don't have that on the residential side, and the residential folks don't have a team of environmental consultants to help them out. So it's really
Bradley, if I may,
Yeah.
the emphasis here is being obviously a reasonable fee. Just for context, the conversations that I've had with Solar Cycle and others is more like a $10 a module type of fee. So obviously, if a resi customer has an additional $100, that's not going to make or break whether or not they're going to go solar.
Okay. I mean, with the clarification of the context, I'll vote yes.
Okay. All right. Hold on, I'm just counting. So we have 13 seats. We do have some vacancies. So a yes we would need essentially 7 yes votes to put forward the recommendation. So for this first one right here, I'm just going to put how many yes votes we have and a different color. Oh, we'll make it blue. So we have 6 yes votes and 3 abstain. Hold on. The second one, we have 5 yes, 2 no, and 2 abstain. This version 1, we have 8 yeses. And 1 abstain. Version 2, we have 1 yes, we have 6 no's, and 2 abstain. Okay. This next one, we have 5 yeses, 2 no's, and 2 abstain. So it's the same as this one. This next one, we have 8 yeses and 1 abstain. So it's the same as this one right here. Version 1, we have 1 yes, oh wait, no, sorry, we have 2 yeses. We have 4 no's and 3 abstain. Version 2, we have 7 yeses, 1 no, and 1 abstain. This one, the next one, we have 7 yeses again and 2 abstain. This last two, this first one, we have 6 yeses and 1 abstain. Or sorry, I meant to say 3 abstain. And this last one, we have 7 yeses and 2 abstain. All right. So the recommendation that this working group is going to attach to this report are going to be version 1 of this one. This recommendation having to do with the stewardship organization. Version 2 right here for which has to do with prioritizing and promoting incentives for reuse, repair, refurbishment, and recertification. And then workforce training. And then an advanced recovery fee, a small advanced recovery fee for residential solar when you're buying solar, sorry. Any questions on those? Cool. Well, I think that that is, well, except opening it up for the public, that was all that I had for this meeting. I think we're going to adjourn next sometime next year, probably in February, and then or we could also open that up to this to the work group members as well. But this was just the initial thought. In February, starting up again, gives some people a break over the holidays. Alternatively, we can wait until after the legislative session as well. So just wanted to open that up to the working group on your thoughts on that.
You know, as a guy who's in legislative session and decisively engaged, I just assume wait till after the session, but that's just one vote.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a busy session. What are some other folks' thoughts on that? And just since we did a lot of presentations on like the context and the environmental, like what it's like in terms of the current state, essentially, the next year would essentially be talking about policy recommendations and refining those. Any other? So we have one vote for after the session.
I agree with Delegate Rogers. Post session.
Post session.
Agree.
All right. I'm a glutton for punishment. I'm fine with session, but I would be fine scheduling these meetings. We'd have monthly meetings after session. David Comas.
Hi, I know I'm not a delegate on this, but I'm concerned with the large number of abstentions that occurred, and that maybe we're not providing as many recommendations as we would otherwise do without the large number of abstentions, or with a larger number of people on the committee. I don't know. I understand you're following the rules, but I'm just concerned that we're not going to be presenting as much as we probably would have or should have had the people who were on the committee and then left still been here and voted.
I think that's a fair point. Just we are going again. We'll get another bite at the apple, and we're going to try and fill those vacancies, and that is something that we can work on in the next coming months. But I definitely do hear the concern. Any other? Does anyone else want to comment on that?
I mean, I would just say, I guess, also, I'm not sure that those ones that there were a lot of abstentions would have passed if you had more voices from the solar industry. I mean, I know you have David Bugelman here, presumably on utility scale, and me, sort of presumably on DG. I know Stacy's here for community solar, but she represents a utility, not actually an asset owner. So I think if we are going to consider sort of expanding who is on this, I guess I would just encourage you to actually include the companies that need to invest, own, and operate these types of products. And I'm not sure that the votes would really change that much if you did that.
Yeah, and I'll echo that. Part of my concern has been the lack of industry participation and sort of that viewpoint, which is why I was very cautious on recommendations that would impose sort of hard and fast requirements without them being fully vetted by the industry.
Yeah, so I'll actually be sending out an email for recommendations to fill the vacancies from the entire group. Again, I can't remember how this one works, but some of them are approved by our secretary and some of them are approved by the governor. So we will have to work through that. But there's definitely a lot of talented folks in this space that should be able to help out with this. And maybe even some of our speakers as well. So that there might be an opportunity there. All right. Are we good to move on to the public comment? Are there any comments from the public at this point? Hearing none, just wanted to thank everyone for an excellent year. I learned a lot. It was a fascinating process. And then I look forward to working with this group in the future and proposing policy recommendations that are really going to help help with end-of-life management for solar panels. So we don't have a bunch of solar panels that are starting to stack up in 5, 10, 20 years. All right, thank you. I'm gonna end the recording right now.
Yep, thank you all.
Thanks, Bradley.
Thanks.